scanning the whole section.
Sorry, a little messy,
Okay.
but we gotta move on.
Yeah.
There you go.
I'll take one. Thank you. We can share. David, thank you. As always, David manages to actually make sense of the complexity of this space. And there's a lot going on, and what David has done in the last few years, one of the companies at Aging 2.0, just really interesting conversation backwards and forwards about people who are learning and developing and sort of cutting edge. This stuff is a paradox. I think this is what we're going to talk about on this panel. It's such an interesting space. You know, is it an industry sector? Is it multiple sectors? This is a big question. There's a paradox of the numbers of people in this space. There's a paradox of the fact that people have 70% of the consumer wealth, yet are not really sort of spending it in any sort of sizable manner. So the panel here is really about the perfect storm. Many of the factors, many of the trends are really quite exciting, moving in the direction of this being sort of the next big thing. Is this the new emerging markets on our doorstep? Or is this one of those sort of mirages that is sort of just constantly moving back into the horizon? So I'll sit down because it's a bit awkward if I'm standing and they're all sitting. Just to kind of get a sense of the room, who here is working in a tech startup or a tech company? Just a quick show of hands. Who here is, let's say, like corporate, working for a big company with over 1,000 employees? Okay, so bigger. Who here is over 80 years old? Not so many. Excellent. You age well, sir. You age well. Excellent. So I think it's really a diverse group, and the idea here is to kind of get a bit of a sense from our different panelists. Ken from Stanford, Gary from Kaiser, Courtney from Lyft, and Sunit from 3M. So all sort of different perspectives on an emerging space. I sort of just wanted to start off by going down the line, doing a quick intro in their own words. Who are you? Very quickly. And there's sort of one response to the question. Are we in a perfect storm? Is this aging topic a mirage that's never going to arrive, or are we finally here with the next biggest opportunity that we can imagine? So over to you, Gary, to kick things off.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. I was trying to think, like, why am I on this panel, first of all? And I think actually my biggest qualification is that my grandmother is 106 years old. So I guess that qualifies me in some sense. I am the director of the innovation consultancy for Kaiser Permanente. And actually, my real qualification is that I am working on an initiative with Kaiser Permanente to redesign the end-to-end system for the delivery of services into the home. The question that you asked about, is this the perfect storm, takes me back 30 years. 30 years ago, I was working for a company called Herman Miller, the office furniture manufacturer. And I don't know if you know them, they're based in Western Michigan, great design company, et cetera. And they were looking at the role that the environment could play in letting people age in their homes 30 years ago. This was before Ken Dykewald wrote his book, Age Wave, actually. And probably our biggest learning from all of that is we were so far out ahead of the game that it never really materialized in that point. And so fast forward 30 years, now on the precipice of being maybe one of those aging boomers myself, I think we feel like, at least at Kaiser Permanente, that the answer is yes. I'm not sure it has so much to do now with the aging of the population, which is important, but I think it has to do with a lot of the economic pressures that we have on healthcare today that are really driving us to want to move care into the home and focus on that as an additional venue, essentially.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So Sunit, if you could introduce a little bit about 3M, and then are we in a storm or a mirage?
Yeah, hi, my name is Sunit. I'm at 3M Ventures organization out here in Silicon Valley. And I would say that we're not in the beginning of the storm. I'd say we're probably smack dab in the middle of it. Mainly, we've seen aging population in China and Japan for 10 years already. 3M's 30 billion, 20 billion outside the United States. We have a unique perspective in terms of having the entire globe to play in. And I think the aging population here, the healthcare costs going up, along with technology becoming more and more ubiquitous, kind of connecting us together, I would actually say it's probably going to get a lot worse in the rest of the world in the next 15, 20 years than it is here. Healthcare is, a little less regulated, and there's a lot more population that's about to get old. So I would say, if anything, it's just the beginning, and we'll see where it goes.
I think I got one. Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Baker. I lead our healthcare partnerships at Lyft. I've spent the last 12 or so years of my career doing consulting or technology within the hospital health system space. And I think it's an interesting question to ask if we're in the beginning of the storm related to either aging populations or elder mobility or even the healthcare space. And, Lyft, who is typically a company that you would think of just a straight B2C company that has a lot of young, tech-savvy end users. It's interesting to see how we've pivoted into the healthcare space. It's not something that Lyft sought out directly, but it's something that found Lyft. So the short version of the story really is that Medicaid and non-emergent medical transportation providers approached Lyft because of the just high value transportation that we could provide. So Lyft is typically at a much lower cost to other alternatives and typically has really good feedback and customer service associated with it. And through that, we also saw additional smaller tech companies approaching us and saying, we want to find ways to solve the access issue that we find with an aging population who has less access to transportation, potentially has lost a driver's license, but still needs to have access to not only medical appointments, but other social determinants of health. And I think that's where Lyft pivoted very quickly to embrace that opportunity and make sure that we could serve both those startups as well as some of the direct provider spaces. So it's been an interesting space for us, and we continue to see it grow with companies, I'm sure, like several of you that are in the room today, as well as at a national level.
Hi, my name's Ken Smith. I work at the Stanford Center on Longevity, which very briefly kind of think of as a place that is looking to kind of make the fact that most of the population is getting to live to be advanced age a good thing, using the kind of research that goes on all around the university. And I tend to cover kind of the physical side of aging as well as technology and aging. And I think the idea of a perfect storm I was thinking about really kind of indicates that there's a number of factors converging that sort of makes it perfect, and I think there are in this case. First is the demographics, which I suspect everybody in this room, if you're here, probably has some understanding of how quickly the population is aging. Everybody's heard the 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day. But it's also in that space, people staying in their homes for economic reasons, and preference reasons. We've probably heard that AARP has said that 90+% of people prefer to stay in their home as they age, but at the same time, people are economically stuck in their homes, and California might be the place where you can see that the most clearly. So you've got that piece of it. You also have a bunch of technology that's emerging into the kind of consumer cost level space, things like voice-activated technologies, smart speakers, broadband, kind of everywhere, cloud computing at super cheap levels that kind of make the home a much more tech-friendly kind of place to be. And then the third thing that I really think has just emerged in the last couple of years is that the large consumer businesses, the P&Gs of the world, are waking up to this as a big trend. And I've been doing this at Stanford for about 9 years, and I would say it's the last 2 or 3 in which we started to talk to the Procter & Gambles and the Targets and the Hondas and the Toyotas, as opposed to the Brookdales and the Home Insteads. And so I think all those things coming together kind of says this thing seems to be ready to pop.
Thanks all. I think it's quite interesting as we look at the panel on aging, and there's really only one sort of legit, healthcare provider in the old sort of school way of thinking about it. And a lot of people perhaps think that aging is just about healthcare, right? And here in the panel, I think this is indicative of what Chetan and the team are trying to sort of convey and explore around aging at home, is that this is a society level conversation. Gary, you were saying you were sort of in charge of redesigning the system of home. I just don't know if you could expand a little bit more about what sort of Kaiser's thinking about this and how you are starting to move beyond, if you are, the traditional role of healthcare into the community.
Yeah, I think that the first thing you notice when you kind of look at this industry, the classic home health industry in particular, it's sort of been the stepchild of healthcare. It's not efficient. The customer experience is bad. The continuity of care is just really poor for the most part. We talk about it a lot as our members, while we feel we do a great job with them in our facilities and taking care of them, when we send them home, they're kind of in the Wild West and they're left to a lot of they're left really on their own. I mean, we kind of call that an experience of discontinuity as well. And so for us, it really is about moving care, out into that community so that we can connect with people and really try to put those pieces together, make it more efficient, make it feel like kind of a modern, 21st century consumer experience, quite frankly. The model that, I'll just make one plug for a model that we're following or very interested in that people can take a look at, is this model out of the Netherlands called the Buurtzorg. If you haven't read about it, you should.
Can you spell that, because it's got
Yeah,
most
because
ridiculous.
it's not spelled how you would imagine, of course, right?
lots of U's.
B-U-U, two U's, R-T-Z-O-R-G. It really is an effort to move, to your point, to move care deep into the community with these kind of self-organizing nursing teams that live and work right in a zip code or in a neighborhood or in a few block area for where they practice and deliver care. And it's extraordinary. In the course of a few years, the Netherlands have set up about 1,000 of these Buurtzorg nursing environments, about 100,000, now let's see, what is it, about 35,000 people now work in this environment. And it's just a radically different way to think about the delivery of care at a very grassroots, very boots on the ground kind of way. And I think it's certainly a model that we're looking at, not necessarily to wholesale adopt from the United States. We have a very different kind of population and geographic dispersion, but I think it's a good start.
And that's actually something that we get onto a little later, which is, from what I understand, they are very autonomous. The small groups of maybe 10 or so people go out and they essentially take a region, and they have a business objective as well as a technical objective as well as a user experience, and everybody can do everything. They're all given the power. And so there's some really interesting insights into your point about the quality of managerial talent, if you like, and the quality of the business experience so far perhaps hasn't been as it should be, but then some of this new, essentially managerial thinking that's coming in is really quite exciting. So I'd be very interested to see how that goes. So from a sort of global perspective, Sunit, and you sort of mentioned some of the need to have a broader a view of things. Obviously, Japan has been blazing the trails, if that's the right phrase, for this. But they've been doing some things right. They've been obviously they did a reframing of their long-term care system in 2000, so they've now got less than 10% of their GDP spending on health, which is significantly less than we spend. China has been mandating some sort of quite robust policies where you have to look after your parents or else ... So just sort of from your perspective as a global company, so what are some of the trends and sort of driving factors that you think are going on around the world that we could perhaps learn from and engage with and perhaps benefit in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, right? Because we think about healthcare and assume that it has to do with doctors or nurses. I mean, part of this is, just take the Asian countries. In general, family is very important over there, right? But my mom likes to talk to my kids. And so that's part of her health, right? Every day is getting to talk, part of my mental health as well, that they can be offloaded there for 10 minutes at a time. But I think like all of those different things around importance of family and how you view the delivery of just general health, I think is pretty critical. And I think that it's, when you combine that with the different comfort with technology, I think it starts becoming really interesting, right? Because if my mom dislocated her shoulder, she needs to go to the ER. I can spend $500 on an ambulance, or maybe I can take a Lyft. And I think there's as much being driven from the younger generation up on why certain things are happening. So I think in Japan and China, where you have this huge burgeoning population that have grown up very tech savvy, they're forcing the technology up, if you will, into the older demographics. I don't think you get around the idea that policy is going to impact any decision. I mean, the unbundling of the codes for remote patient monitoring, right? PCT code, sorry. In the U.S. means that now doctors can get reimbursed for doing telemed. I mean, it's going to be a combination of all of them. So you have this younger population that's basically grown up not knowing what a sound of a modem is, who are trying to communicate with their parents who probably grew up with like a landline in their home, who now have kids who don't even understand what a keyboard is. So like there's like 3 distinct generations that are there, and that's going to force the issue. And if last Tuesday was any indication, Congress just got a lot younger in the U.S., which means these policies are going to start reflecting that. And generally, government is behind reality in terms of technology. So as the policy starts catching up, you can do that. Asia's a little more kind of authoritarian on that. We're a little bit more democratic. I think if you want to see potentially where the U.S. can go, I would maybe look at India, right? So a little bit more of a democratic place. And it's hard. It's hard for them to do things when you're there. But India's leapfrogged us in a lot of areas in terms of healthcare, technology, infrastructure, and all of those things put together are what's going to drive this forward.
Sure. Thank you. So Gary had a nice plug for one of his projects. Anything in particular that you're excited about in terms of recent investments or projects that 3M is working on this space that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it pretty broadly. You have to be able to, if you want to support anything in the home, forget about healthcare, just anything in the home, you have to be able to communicate, you have to be able to gather data, you have to be able to then actually do something with that data, and then you actually have to, frankly, make money doing it. And I think that's the thing that we kind of forget, right? It's like, well, is this a perfect storm that's coming? Well, I mean, there's a lot of people investing in it. Why? There's money to be made. That's why. There's a lot of money on the table. So there's one way to know that there's a perfect storm coming. When P&G starts paying attention to an area, there's probably money to be made there. When 3M starts paying attention to an area, there's probably money to be made there, right? I mean,
isn't it from the good of your heart, Chotem?
Yeah,
Look at that face.
And we want to do what's right and what's good, but we also, I mean,
if there's any specific project that you are super excited that you're working on, or if it's all stealth, or
Yeah, no, I mean, we're looking at air quality in general, and that'll cross things like the connected home, all the way through to automotive electrification, which also includes air quality. Because if you're driving around in certain parts of the world, the air can be pretty bad. So how do I make it better?
I saw something about the Tesla today. I was a little jealous I didn't have one. You see, because of the smoke right now, the Tesla, you press the button, and it does some sort of crazy air filtering system. It goes from horrible outside to almost pure within a couple of minutes. If I had the money, I'd buy a Tesla right now. There we go. Anyway, Lyft has been, I think, a really wonderful example of a company that has been making very tangible what we have all known sort of intuitively about for a while, and it's been now sort of crystallized in these social determinants of health and the fact that 80% of the health outcomes are beyond the clinical and institutional care. I mean, I've just gone back, I've been in the US for the last 10 years, just moved back to London, and it's really interesting that same discussion is happening out there, but there's this real crisis because the expectation, understanding that health is happening in the community has happened to correspond at the same time in the UK with 50% reduction in funding for local councils, and even things like Meals on Wheels are now become less than sort of 25% over the country have them compared to what they had before. And so there's this real need for private sector innovators to kind of step in and sort of provide that sort of the knitting together of some of these services. So Courtney, perhaps you could just give us a little bit more flavor on some of the projects. And I know that some of the projects that you've been working on have actually had some pretty impressive ROIs and impact that might be good to hear about.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's an interesting concept. It's no secret that most of us, fully understand in this room that there's definitely a consumerism that is driving healthcare in the aging populations. Every individual has to be smarter with every dollar that they're spending as they enter an aging population or even within healthcare, and it's a large reason why there is maybe some misunderstanding out there about Lyft providing rides to an acute setting. My legal team will require me to remind you all that if you're ever in an urgent scenario, please dial 911 and not a Lyft. But it's an interesting conversation to have because you have people who understand the hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars that it can cost just to have an emergent transportation to the setting, and they realize and understand that a Lyft can be $7 instead of the $1,000+ that it may cost to ride in an ambulance. And that's where, again, it's not a surprise as to why healthcare kind of found Lyft, and Lyft didn't necessarily find healthcare, but it's certainly an area that our executive team has doubled down on to say we not only see this as an opportunity to fulfill a need, specifically within key areas, but we also see it as an area that will continue to grow. We have to think outside of the box. We have a very large competitor out there. Many of you in the room here are always worried about where your competitors are doing as well. And we have to think beyond just the younger generation that's used to using a smartphone. We need to think about the population that is aging and find unique ways to serve them. And if we think, again, just specifically about the healthcare space and the aging population, there are 3.6 million missed medical appointments every year because of lack of transportation. So if Lyft can help solve that specific area, that's where we've worked with a lot of innovators within the space to find, real reasons to fulfill that need. There's a company actually, and I was looking out to see if Justin was in the room today. GoGo Grandparent is a great example of a technology that Lyft has really enabled them. They sort of saw an open opportunity that there was a need in the space for a dial-a-ride option, and we partnered very closely with them to make sure that they had access to Lyft's API. So I would encourage you all to think through that as well. To the extent that you have a need for transportation within your own business model, it's something we're always open to discussing with you and just further enabling what your superpower might be. We realize our superpower is transportation, but there's a far bigger perspective in the consumerization of healthcare, the consumerization of the aging population that you all can work to provide, that Lyft doesn't really intend to get into those additional spaces, but we hope to supplement and provide the transportation piece and solve that access issue so that we can supplement what you may already be doing there.
Thank you, Courtney. And I can't remember the name of it right now. I know there's another company that does on-demand transportation, but how do you sort of differentiate yourself? Is it around your culture? Is it around your having worked with you guys the last few years? There's definitely something about the DNA that I think I was quite happy to see the connection that you'd be making with the senior care and with this organization. But is culture your sort of defining difference from the competition, or what you tell me?
Yeah, I think Lyft has stayed hyper-focused on the healthcare space, and we continue to see leadership support in key areas because of the opportunity that we see at play there. We have a lot of other options. There are other avenues we could go down in terms of our growing and expanding our business. Healthcare definitely fits directly with what Lyft's mission and values are, and that's why I think we've seen our organization stay so hyper-focused on it, whether that's with payers, with elder care, elder mobility space, whether it's directly to providers. It's something, again, I think that the culture alignment makes the most sense in terms of how we differentiate ourselves.
Great, thank you. And before too long, we're gonna open it up for some questions from the audience. But Ken, I wanted to kind of come to you and talk a little bit about systems. Here in Silicon Valley, clearly the most important thing is to be a unicorn. I mean, nothing else matters. Is that right? I mean, I sort of get the sense that we are very startup, success focused in that perspective. But one of the things that I'm interested in what you're doing is really taking a holistic approach to aging and sort of really understanding the fact that this is about society, changing society in general. It's about intergenerational sort of framing. But just want to understand a little bit about, do you think this is, and I've sort of led with my point of view, do you think this is as a point solution or something that we're going to find sort of startups to kind of fill the need, or or are we going to have to work in systems? And if so, what does that even mean to you? What is like a system is a very abstract concept for most people.
Okay. So I think I'll start by just saying, recognize that the way we look at things from the Center on Longevity is not a center on old age or a center on aging. It's a center on long life. And we are, in fact, not just adding, we often are just adding years at the end of life. And in fact, it's much more of a continuum. And, you know, so today's 70-year-old is not your grandfather's 70-year-old, for example, right? And so I think we often look at aging technology, or technology for aging in place. I mean, to me, it's technology, right? And the idea, and you're exactly right in terms of people looking for the unicorns and looking for the one-off solution that's going to be, okay, here is the medication management solution, or here is the fall detection solution that's going to solve everything. But honestly, I think what's growing and where I see a lot of the opportunity is in sort of integration into the technologies writ large that are finding our way into homes, right? I mean, one way of looking at it, I mean, this would be a good one for Lyft. There was a study done recently at the MIT Age Lab that looked at the potential for what I guess I'll call platform-based services, the kind of thing you can dial up on your cell phone. Because nowadays you can pretty much get anything you want from home. I mean, as you see the build out of Amazon Home Services and all the various food things. And so they went to an assisted living facility, and they cataloged all the various things that were being provided for the people who were living there. So this was all the food, all the laundry, all the maintenance, and then did a thought experiment and went to the internet and said, if I was at home and I was acquiring all of these services through these various methodologies, what would it cost me? And they came up with something, I think it was $3,964, so just shy of $4,000. Actually, I got that wrong. It was $2,964. And the rent in Boston, where they are, is about $3,000. So they made an estimate that to have all of those services at home and pay for your home was a little shy of $6,000 when comparing with an assisted living facility that was upwards of $7,000. So I think it's kind of instructive of the fact that these services are finding their way in. And so I think where a lot of these are going to come from, a lot of the solutions are going to be, how are we integrating with those platform-based services? How are we going to use the APIs that Amazon has recently opened up around Amazon to build voice-activated front ends on all sorts of other technology? How are we going to use the social networking platforms that we have to attack loneliness in maybe a little bit more user-friendly or person-centric kind of way? And so I think while I go places that say they're working on aging and technology, I'm always suspicious if they're working at that little bit at the top of the pyramid that applies only to aging. Because I think the worst way to sell into aging is by age, right? Nobody buys a product because they just turned 75. There's a joke that goes around, Jack Rowe, who started the gerontology program at Harvard, has said there's been one product that has successfully been sold that way, and it's the food for dogs that are over 12 years old. And other than that, no one has found a way into the market based on that. Aging is event-driven, and it's not a person who turned 70, it's a person who just got out of the hospital and broke a hip and suddenly doesn't know about all the mobility solutions they need. And I think finding ways to bring in the regular technology that we're seeing kind of permeate the whole population, and finding ways to identify where that intersects with people as they experience these events as they get older, I think that convergence is going to be where we see a lot of opportunity.
It's interesting because I suspect that one of the reasons why people would still pay $7,000 for their assisted living is because there's somebody at the front desk I can go to. And I worry if I'm spending $2,000 a month on apps, then I probably got 13 different apps, maybe 5 different boxes in the corner of my room and usernames and passwords that I can't even remember. So, I mean, is this an opportunity for the industry to actually make it easier to do that? Or is this just, again, it's just a very difficult thing because nobody likes to play ball together and actually integrate? Anybody wants to take that?
I'll take the first crack, and just that I don't think there right now is a recognized, I'll use the housing building perspective, general contractor, that there is a trusted partner that somebody can go to when they experiencing experience one of these events of aging, that they can figure out what's out there. And so that you're right, the aging services provider gives you that sort of concierge you can go to, one-stop shopping. There's an opportunity out there, although, you know, how to establish yourself as that trusted partner is a tough problem in and of itself. So.
I just had a quick comment as well about how Lyft is approaching this. Lyft obviously is here to provide the world's best transportation in terms of rides, but we can only do that if we have an amazing driver ecosystem. And we've recently partnered with AARP to look at the subset of individuals who is 65, but still very much capable and willing and wanting to still work, maybe not to the extent of the full-time employment that they previously had. Maybe they've just recently retired, but driving for Lyft is a great opportunity for them to work on their own schedule, work part-time, and then get them used to utilizing our platform so that 10 years later down the line, when they have, let's say, had an adverse event and are in need of transportation, they're used to it from even being a driver. So I think it's sort of interesting to think about the ecosystem in general around how you can engage individuals early on that then can affect sort of downstream once they reach the age of needing the opposite side of the service you're offering. So it's been an interesting, at least, use case for us and where we're partnering there.
Thank you. The other thing that we don't do here in Silicon Valley, or don't talk about too much, is sort of the government perspective. Yet if you think about half of the total dollars on aging in this country, and certainly more in other countries, are related to government programs at some level. Sunit, you mentioned that perhaps India would be one other country to look at, given that it's a relatively sort of lighter touch regulatory perspective. Yet if I was going to choose where I'd want to grow old, having lived in Europe, having lived in the States, frankly, Northern Europe is quite a nice place to be, especially if I don't have any money and I'm old. The state looks after me and things work really well from the perspective of there's very few people slipping through the cracks. I was speaking with some folks in Norway recently. They've got the $1 trillion wealth fund from the North Sea oil. They have a gold-plated, high-touch senior experience, but even they are worried that they're not going to be able to afford this going forward for the next few decades. So I just kind of wanted to throw out the question of government. To what extent can we think about them as an asset and as an ally? We don't necessarily need to be too political and contemporary in this country, but how are you guys factoring in the role of government in this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just part of any real stakeholder analysis that you have. If you want to start a business, you have to understand all the implications of all the different folks that can influence your business, and government has to be one of them. So, I don't know that there's a good answer, right? I mean, I think the answer is really, really long, and not something you can kind of soundbite. The bottom line is that the government, if you take the U.S., the U.S. government is a lot for healthcare right now. I'm not sure that I would say that the coverage is great. But I don't know. So much of what we have in this country is privatized already. But even if you look at, Canada has a centralized healthcare system, the UK has a centralized healthcare system, and yet every single person I know that lives in those countries has private healthcare. And so, I think it's easy to say we should centralize or not centralize it, but I think you have to take into account scale. We have 300, 400 million people in the US. Canada has less. Norway has less. So, I think it's hard. I think even if, I don't know, how many people does Kaiser have on their plan right now, just in California?
9 million.
So there are
twice the size of Finland.
Yeah. So maybe the better comparison is what's Kaiser doing compared to Finland, because that's like you have to think about all of these things from that perspective. You can't just say Finland has great healthcare, the U.S. doesn't. Well, I understand, but you're talking about different things. That's like suggesting that a startup should have the same manufacturing processes that 3M has. We have 90,000 people. Trust me, we can scale up a plant pretty quickly. A startup can. It's a different. You're in a different league.
Yeah.
So that's how I would answer that question. I think it's a much more detailed conversation from that startup perspective. Though, when you're thinking about where to go, I think the comment about 10 years down the line is really critical. because the aging population is about to get bigger, but the folks that are going to be quote unquote 65 in 10 years are significantly more tech savvy than the people who are there now. So if you're planning on making this into a billion-dollar business in 10 years, you can't be thinking about what's going to work now, because 10 years from now, the fact that people don't know what a tablet is when they're 65 today, it's not going to be the same. So you have to think about a tech savvy aging population that's going to get there in 10 years, and that's the business you have to go after. And I think that's the other thing is, you know, government, what's going to happen in 10 years in the government? I mean, I don't know. I can't, I'm not even going to bother to get into that. But you do know that they're going to have more money, they're going to be more tech savvy, and they're probably going to have a slightly higher influence on the government than the younger people, if you view by history.
How about you, Gary? From your perspective, how do you interface with the government? Is it a force for innovation, or is it holding you back?
Well, this is by no means my sweet spot, by any means. But obviously for us, we're on both sides of that equation. Obviously, they're our customer as well as a regulator. For us, I would say, you know, recent events in Medicare seem promising. They're loosening things up. They're allowing more things in. They certainly are starting to change what they'll pay for and the payer mix. And that seems all, at least from the delivery of services to the home, you know, to be a really positive direction. How fast that happens and how fast that, you know, unfolds will to be determined. I mean, I think, you know, we are sitting on a couple of time bombs. I was just looking it up this morning. I was just thinking about it. Medi-Cal, our Medicaid program here in California, 40% of its budget goes to long-term care. Today, it costs $100,000 a year now on average. This is just a completely unsustainable, you know, model, and something's got to be done around some of these. I realize that the slide showed that there aren't that many people in SNF or in skilled nursing facilities, but when you multiply it by $100,000 a person, it's a very substantial thing. So I think that's an area for us. I mean, it's something we've been thinking about, and as well as some of these extremely expensive venues of care. What can we do about those? I think technology's got a pretty big role in some of that, and I think the federal government and our state government is going to really look to innovation in those areas, just because the numbers are so, you know, substantial.
Just want to give a shout out to a company I mentioned before, Meals on Wheels. They were talking at our last year's conference about a pay for success model, which I thought was quite interesting, where they started to work with Maryland to deliver the Meals on Wheels, and they have this concept of more than a meal. So it's not just the food, it's also a certain sort of lightweight case management. They have sort of social connection. They have eyes and ears, if you like, on the person, and they were sort of developing this model by which they would engage with the older people and then sort of see how they're doing from a health perspective and the health costs. They would be able to compare those with people outside the system, and if they were able to bend the cost curve, they would share in the upside, which I thought was quite an interesting model, especially because Meals on Wheels is not necessarily the name that you associate with sort of cutting-edge business model innovation. But that kind of thing gave me a suggestion that if you look at it from some of the numbers you're saying, the government is just spending a fortune on this population, and perhaps the way they're doing it, if they just moved a little bit in terms of some of this direction, they could be a real force for good. I want to open up for the audience. Other sort of questions, perspectives, comments, jokes. We get jokes. If you got jokes, it'd be nice. Somebody at the back, before I pick on people who look like they're not paying attention. No. Andy always got a question. No? Okay. Oh, we have one over there. Perfect. Oh, there's two. There's hundreds. Fantastic. Please.
Me? Okay. Is there a problem with the aging at-home systems that we have now? And if you think there is, what is the problem?
Nick, just give us a little bit more context on what you're thinking about when you're saying aging at home system. You're talking about
the way we
non-medical or
the way we
home
knit
health?
everything together at home, which is an integration concept, and then there are some almost implications that e-systems that we have for e-commerce and transportation aren't working well, and we're trying to fix something, but is there some basic need that we have to system integrate all this that we don't have?
I mean, I think Ken, to Ken's point, I mean, I feel there's this general contractor need of somebody who's able to be a force for good, who can understand what you're looking for. I also have a comment answering that one if I can, because one of the concepts we've been hearing about in the UK is sort of this idea of a purpose pathway. You know, what is that individual purpose of you in the home? I think a lot of the technology-driven perspectives are sort of throwing tech at older people. And I think what we don't do enough of, perhaps, is listening to their individual journeys and their individual goals. It might be that somebody wants to go traveling to Italy to see their kid get married, or they want something else. But I feel that we haven't seen enough, and I'm looking at Ken because he's holding the microphone, but that's the sort of thing that they do at Stanford, which is sort of think about it from a older person's perspective rather than just which bit of the tech industry isn't working.
So I wouldn't say that it's that I think what's happening, I guess is a better way to say it, is I don't think that taking care of people in the home in the way we have for the past however many years is necessarily lacking, but what's changing is the people that are living in those homes and how long they're continuing to live there. I mean, there's this idea of a shift of acuity that the people that used to be in hospitals are now in skilled nursing homes. The people there are now in assisted living. The people that used to be in assisted living are still living at home. And the economics, say that this generation that is retiring is not prepared for retirement financially. They're going to be in their homes longer, and enabling them to live in their homes longer with chronic disease, perhaps multiple chronic diseases, I think is a change, because those people in the past would have probably had to go somewhere else. And so now either we fill in the gap with millennials, because they got to live with their parents, potentially anyway, and really intergenerational solutions may be part of what changes here, or fill in some of that gap possibly with technology.
I would just say that I don't know that anything is necessarily broken, but I think people are looking for more efficient ways to do it. So right now, if I have to take my mom to the hospital and I'm in my office in San Mateo and she's down in San Jose and it's 4 o'clock, what's she gonna do, wait an hour and a half for me to get home? I mean, so I think you start combining different things, right? So there's this huge trend of urbanization. Just think globally, so many people are moving into the cities, but they're all coming from small towns, suburbs, villages. As that population gets older, how are you going to meet those needs? Specifically when it used to be just multi-generational, you take care of your mom, you take care of your dad as you get older. That people are just much more mobile today. And then I think with connectivity, there's also just the expectation that I should be able to do more from the home. So I think as you start putting those things together, it's just, I think we're trying to be more efficient. I don't think we've ever done care at home. I think it's brand new. So the ability to, hey, I want to monitor the air quality in your house. I want to check your heart rate. I want to understand whether you've actually taken your prescriptions versus you just telling me. I actually want to be able to know that you took it, and I can do all of those things while you sit on your lazy boy is fantastic. And I should be able to do that because that's ultimately going to reduce the cost to Kaiser. Rather than having everybody come into Kaiser, it's also going to reduce the infrastructure, the cost of gas. I mean, it is, and I think you go from a point solution, which I think we have a lot of point solutions right now. When you start putting the whole picture together, you're going to create a system that theoretically should enable the lowering of what we spend on healthcare, because so much of what we can do should be able to be done outside of the care setting. And it trickles through not just to health, but like all the way through to things like your grid, like the electricity consumption, your air quality with all the pollution, traffic, all of that's going to be impacted if you can do things more efficiently in the home.
So you mentioned an intergenerational solution. It's pretty much a given that the number of caregivers available is dropping rapidly from a 7 or 8 to 1 older adult today to 3 or 4 possibly in the future. So I think Gary kind of slid quickly over the real solution to the aging issue has to be in part technology-based. there has to be technologies that resolve medication adherence issues, social isolation, communication with family. Is that not the thrust of,
Gary, were you avoiding the question?
That was. Yeah, and I would say in looking at the system that we're looking at, the kind of technology that is really, really interesting to us right now is these kind of human technology hybrids. Things that empower people, enable them to do more things, enable people to be more broadly skilled than what kind of their natural abilities might be. Maybe because we're a little bit more short-term in our thinking. I'm not sure we're ready to turn stuff over completely to technology, but these hybrids seem really powerful. I think, like, for an example, like if we can send somebody out into the home, a PT or an aide or a nurse type person, and we could put systems in their hands that allow them to have a broader range of skills, that improves the distribution then of those skills, of those things out into the field. If I have 50 specialists and I've got to get them spread out all over, LA County, that's really complicated, and I can end up with, 2-hour drives getting around. And so for us right now, these kind of human technology hybrids really seem promising. I don't see a lot of work being done in the startup world in that space. It seems like it's, technology to replace human interaction. But so I would encourage people to look at that side of it as well.
Yeah, I would underline that. I think there's we're calling them digital prosthetics some of the time, and there's a company called AgeWell Global that some of you might have come across. It's actually from South Africa, where they have older people empowered with, they get it trained up, they get tablets, and they go out to speak to other older people about how to stay independent. For example, when they've just been discharged from hospital, they kind of give them a plan. And it's much better conversation to have 70 to 70-year-old than it is a spotty 18-year-old, or, it's just there's a dynamic there. And I think the other piece here is about an education where I would love to see them help each other. There's a wonderful organization called Oats, Senior Planet, back in New York, where they have a tech center, and they train older people to get connected, get online, and they've even got people who have had no internet experience become Etsy salespeople and develop their own little sort of businesses, which I think it sort of gets to sorry, we haven't really touched on, and maybe I'd ask sort of Ken to comment about, when we're talking about aging at home, nothing about this title suggests that we stick to the health sphere, right? I mean, I think there's as much about how do we make older people more valued and being able to contribute in society than they are today. And I would actually suggest that I think that part is broken. I think if you look at the inherent ageism in this country and in most countries, there's an expectation. I got an email just yesterday from a 67-year-old guy who's had an incredible background. He just cannot get an interview for a regular job now, and he is just completely beside himself because he's got so much to contribute. And whether he's living at home or working in an office, there's a type of a failure that we have, that we're not doing enough to empower and give people the skills, or on the other side, to make the economy more worthy of, or more sort of receptive to these points of view. But I don't know, Ken, if you had a perspective on sort of the working side of things.
Two comments. One is, you mentioned the caregiver ratio, and while I think it's still going in the direction that you're indicating, there's a numerator and a denominator there, right? And we're all assuming that people past the age of 65 are no longer contributing, right? They're the people who are being taken care of by people younger than 65. Typically, it's, I think, 18 to 65 is the caregiver range. And I think there is a place where it fits into what you're saying, that culturally, people at 65 now are most, I want to say off the top of my head, something like 80 or 85% report that they don't have any disability that keeps them from working. So part of the solution might be redefining what we're calling old. And so then the second part of that question was really what other things, to the home, and that talks to work as well. And You know, we started a program on work at the Center on Longevity probably 4 years ago. And we started down with the premise of trying to convince older individuals that they really should consider working longer because it was, you know, beneficial for them financially. We can show data that it's probably good for them cognitively and health-wise. And immediately ran into the issue that it's not the older people that's the issue, it's the employers, right? And so now we've actually got a program working with large employers trying to understand what those barriers are, how you try to knock those down. And then adjacent to that is how there are these other models of work that are emerging and how we engage older individuals, you know, in those models as well. And the home really, I think, becomes, if not a place of work, certainly a hub for work. I mean, I think we're probably going to move to a much more fluid model of what work is and where you do it and how long you do it. Because most older individuals will say they want to continue to be engaged, but perhaps not at the pace of a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And so I think developing those models are probably almost equally as important to developing healthcare models.
Just a couple quick facts. 35 million people in the United States are caregivers for somebody 50 years or older. I think in our minds, there's a model that says those are the children of older parents. That's not true. The average age of those caregivers is about 65 years old. So it is mostly significant others and friends of whatnot of older aging people that are the caregivers as well. And I think that's it's just an untapped resource. I don't mean it in a sense of like I'm not belittling or how difficult it is to be a caregiver in some of these situations, but there just isn't a lot of support there, either emotionally or from an information standpoint, et cetera. And I think it's just there's tremendous potential in that group.
Well, one comment on that. We've started to try to think about, you know, we have this whole culture built on a 3-generation model. You have kids and, you know, kind of middle-aged people, and then you have older people. We're kind of moving to a 4-generation model as people continue to live longer and longer. And so now there's that third piece in the middle there between what you normally call an adult and what you call an older person. And somebody actually from the financial services industry drove it home because they were talking to one of their clients about their wills and where they were leaving money, and they said, well, they had always dreamed that they were going to leave a legacy to their child so that they could go out and start a business, but their child was 69 now.
I think this is a fascinating area, but I suspect that Chetan and another question, Chetan and Alan are probably going, where's the gadget that I can build to make it easier for people to work longer? And I think that's a fair question. It's also one for all of us to think. We have our pitch events for the last 6 years. We've had over 500 pitch events, and I'd say 95% of them are for, you know, older people are sick, let's have a widget that helps them get better. And, you know, I think we've discussed that it needs to be more than just a widget, it's about a system, but we also need to think that older people are not just, you know, problems to be solved, but there's a piece there. But I think it probably goes beyond just a question of a company making a product. It's about how do we as a system work better, and how do we as a society change to allow older people to be more sort of valued and productive. We had a question at the back, I think.
Yeah, just kind of looking at the dynamics of someone getting older and who's kind of paying for all these gadgets. So you have the kids who love their parents and want to kind of know more about what's going on in their parents' household, and they're a market, for example. And then you have the insurance companies who would like to know more about what's going on in the household as well so that they could ward off some major healthcare cost. And then there's the older person who may or may not want to be around a lot of sensors. So maybe talk to that a little bit.
So was that a question?
Well, it's just kind of an observation. I don't know.
Just a smart insight, but that's fine. Smart insights are okay too. I wanted to kind of maybe feel free to jump in if there was something that you wanted to pick up on that.
I would comment, I mean, I think if you're Procter & Gamble, I mean, they know, right? You start with the customer, the needs, the experience. That's going to lead to the brand. That's going to lead to the product. And I would say that maybe one of the mistakes that we've made is thinking that any population, call it older or maybe even the very young ones, I think we kind of treat them as problems to be solved. But I mean, maybe we just need to think about it from what's the experience they want to have, right? And it's a segment of the population that has different needs. And if you can meet those needs and build something to meet those needs, then it's going to be fine. If you're Lyft and you have a great idea that, hey, older people tend to be lonely and this is a way to get them into the gig economy, work on their schedule and meet people, It has nothing to do with whether they're good drivers or whether, I mean, it just has to do with meeting that particular need. So I just think you have to reframe what you want to do. So you want to build something, I mean, yeah, so maybe if your customer is the 35-year-old who has a 70-year-old mother who's living by herself, 3 hours away, like, who are you actually selling it for? You're selling it to the younger person, but it has to be made so that the older person will actually use it. And so you have to, it's just goes back to the same stakeholder analysis of who's going to buy, who's going to reimburse, who's actually going to use it. And you have to put those pieces together. And sometimes you just have to kind of play around with different models until one actually sticks. I mean, that's the way I would approach the problem, because I think you're right. There are many, many stakeholders in this space that, I may have the best air quality, heart murmur detection piece in the world, and if no one's going to use it, who cares? It just doesn't matter.
Thanks.
I think it's worthwhile rewinding to David Glickman's talk that there's got to be something in it for the actual person who's using it or being monitored. I think that was one of the lively findings.
I just wanted to, getting to the end of our time, I wanted to just mention a quite interesting stat we had from a company in the UK that was doing home care, where they found that 30% of the time of that domestic home care worker, who was essentially a carer, was actually spent in cleaning. And I think something like 10 or 15% was in transportation as well. And so that kind of raises the question, if we've got this need for specialization, and this need to kind of think more critically about what are those tasks that need to be done, how do we kind of take away the stuff that's not relevant, for example, to maybe a carer doesn't want to be doing the cleaning, but maybe a cleaner is better to do the cleaner, without making it all like a very busy, confusing mess for that older person who needs to have some knowledge. So maybe just Courtney, from your perspective, how do you think, do you work with other organizations when it comes to, for example, sharing your APIs with companies to allow the transportation sort of as a service piece to plug in to it? And do you see that becoming more important going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just the concept that applies in healthcare of working at the top of your license really applies to anyone who's a caregiver. At the end of the day, everyone's time is worth a certain value to them individually. And if that time can be spent sitting next to a loved one and filling out the 10,000th medical intake form on your way to that medical appointment instead of being the person who's actually driving, there's a huge value to be had there in terms of just applying transportation, not just to the individual who may be in need of the medical appointment, but to the caregiver who may be accompanying that person. So that's certainly something that Lyft has spent a lot of time just understanding and figuring out if there's other ways to solve that issue, to the extent, again, that we can solve the access issue. And again, to the question there, we absolutely have an open API today that we'd be happy to partner with anyone on, to the extent that you're interested in understanding how Lyft can just be the transportation solution to what is a much larger solution that you are potentially bringing to the market to offer. So it's something that we very much pride ourselves on in terms of making that an open API, to have that ability to tap into that resource and have the control over managing those rides. Obviously the economics behind it that you can think through, but we're happy to also think through that with you, to the extent we've done it with a lot of other companies in that way.
Okay, so just final comment from each of you, if I can go down the line. We heard from David when he was asked about what the one thing to help entrepreneurs would be distribution that would really make a difference to them. And if we think about trying to really make aging at home a thing, aging at home more than a mirage into a perfect storm of opportunity, what one thing do you think would be most effective to help get us there?
Well, I guess I'll get on, this came up a little bit earlier, I think, from Ken. I think I'll get on my systems soapbox as much as anything, which is just to not look at these things in isolation from one another. I think the comment made earlier with Lively, what do you call it, workflows or system theory, whatever it is you want to call it, really, really, really understanding how the parts all connect to one another, trying to take on as much of that as you can, realistically, I think is important. Obviously, as a big provider, we try to integrate a lot of things. Having APIs that we can plug in to 14 other subsystems that we're working on, I think is critical to any solution for us in this space.
Great, thanks, Gary. There's one vote for systems. Sunil.
Yeah. I think I would, I would think about the longer term play. Just in the last 10 years, the whole idea of, so I have 4 kids, right? So the whole idea that my dad can't believe that I've changed diapers. I mean, and like, you have to think about this from a longer term play. Aging at the home is going to happen over the next 50 years, not just the next 5. So thinking about the different viewpoints that are going to be aging in that home and the solutions around that, I think is something you have to think about. You know, people are going to have different needs, wants, desires, and I think if you just try to solve a point problem, so maybe I'm in the systems camp as well, if you just try to solve a point problem that's relevant today, I think you'll miss the much larger picture there. So I would encourage you to think a little bit more broadly about where the market is going and what are the needs that you can fulfill, starting with the people that are actually going to be using whatever solution you want to provide. That's the other thing that I would say is think about the solution, not the widget. The widgets are fairly easy to make. It's the solution that makes a difference.
Great, thank you.
I think in my perspective, it comes down to just consumerization and value. As we see the shift from the acute space all the way down the line into the home space, there really just comes down to a scenario where technology will enable you to do things at a higher value, not necessarily just cheaper, but really at a higher value, and to the extent that you can work that into whatever it is that is the issue that you're solving, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Nicely put, thanks.
Well, since distribution and systems is taken, that's okay. That's what happens when you're at the wrong end of the stage. I'm going to say a better understanding of where the opportunity points are in people's lives. I mean, aging, as I said before, is an event-driven process. Understanding where those events are and how you can intersect with people at those events, that's the opportunity where they suddenly are looking for value, more than just wanting to continue their day-to-day life.
Sounds good. Awesome. Thank you all, panelists, and enjoy the rest of the event.
Excellent. Thank you so much, panel. Oh, look at that. Wow. Rolling up sleeves.